These are the fighters of the rising sun. Not as legend remembers them. As they actually were. 1. Nakajima Ki-27. The Nakajima Ki-27 was designed to dominate. In 1937, the Imperial Army Air Force needed a frontline fighter to establish air superiority over China, and on paper, the NATE delivered. It was responsive. It turned with unnerving tightness. Early pilots praised its light touch on the controls. But climb into that cramped, exhaust-reeking cockpit, and the compromises became brutally clear. The canopy frame rattled at speed. Ventilation was almost non-existent, trapping the smell of hot oil and engine fumes around the pilot's face at altitude. Fixed landing gear clawed at the wind, bleeding speed in every dive. The airframe was built light, dangerously, philosophically light, stripped of any armor in the pursuit of agility. American volunteer group pilots in China learned quickly: push a NATE into a sustained dive and it wallowed, unable to follow. By 1942 it was obsolete, yet pilots still flew it because nothing better had arrived. It was not a fighter anymore. It was a sentence. 2. Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, the peregrine falcon, carried a fearsome reputation out of the China theater and into the opening months of the Pacific War. Allied pilots encountered its supernatural turn radius and walked away unnerved. But the Oscar's genius was inseparable from its death wish. There was no armor plate behind the seat. The fuel tanks did not self-seal. A single burst from a P-38's nose-mounted battery or a Hellcat's .50 calibers could ignite the entire airframe in seconds. The cockpit smelled of raw aviation fuel, a constant, intimate reminder of how thin the margin was. The butterfly combat flaps gave it a turn radius that almost no Allied fighter could match, but that maneuverability was a trap pilots set for themselves. American aviators learned to refuse the engagement, dive, zoom, and attack from altitude, never circling. By 1944, Oscar pilots were not hunting anymore. The sky above them was owned by someone else, and they dreaded every climb. 3. Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo. The Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki, Demon Queller, was a departure. Japan's Army Air Force wanted something aggressive, a pure interceptor designed to climb fast, hit hard, and break off before the enemy could respond. American B-29 crews, making early high-altitude raids, quickly learned to treat it with cold respect. But the Shoki had a temper that exhausted every pilot who flew it. The Ha-41 engine ran hot, and the cockpit absorbed that heat like a cast-iron furnace. Pilots baked through missions at altitude, sweat stinging their eyes behind goggles. Landing speeds were punishingly high, far beyond what Japanese aviators had trained on, and ground loops shredded landing gear on rough island airstrips with grim regularity. Above 400 miles per hour, the controls stiffened until the stick felt fused to the airframe. It demanded precision. It demanded strength. By 1945, the pilots assigned to it were malnourished teenagers flying on borrowed fuel. The Shoki did not forgive hesitation. And hesitation was all those men had left. 4. Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, Dragon Slayer, was built for destruction. A twin-engine heavy fighter, it carried a 37mm cannon capable of cracking a B-29's aluminum skin open like a tin can, and its intended role was clear: hunt bombers, intercept patrol aircraft, and range far over the Pacific where single-engine fighters could not follow. But the Nick was cursed by its own power plants. Its two Mitsubishi Ha-25 radial engines were chronically unreliable. One would surge without warning, the other might simply seize. Asymmetric thrust wallowed the airframe in yaw, demanding constant, wrenching correction on the rudder pedals. Pilots flew every overwater mission haunted by the arithmetic. One engine failure plus open ocean equaled a slow death. A persistent bone-deep vibration rattled the cockpit at cruise speed and never fully quieted. Night fighting variants added crude radar that further narrowed already poor forward visibility. American crews who survived its attacks never called it clumsy. They called it unpredictable, which was far worse. 5. Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien Swallow was Japan's anomaly. Its liquid-cooled inline engine gave it a silhouette that briefly confused American pilots into thinking they were engaging a German or Italian machine, and that confusion bought it a sliver of dangerous respect. But Japanese pilots were already wary before they even left the ground. The Kawasaki Ha-40 engine, a derivative of the German DB601, leaked coolant through stressed fittings, seized at altitude without warning, and demanded maintenance that the Japanese logistics system simply could not sustain. Coolant lines snaked through the fuselage, and a single rifle caliber hit could spray boiling fluid across the pilot's instruments and hands. Mechanics despised it. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks, waiting for replacement engines that rarely arrived. When the Tony flew, it was genuinely capable, fast, well-armed, and structurally solid compared to lighter Japanese designs. But it rarely flew. And in those cockpits, pilots kept one eye on the temperature gauge at all times, too anxious to fully commit to the fight. 6. Nakajima Ki-84 Frank. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hate Gale was supposed to reverse the tide. By mid-1944, Japan's air forces were being systematically destroyed, and the Frank was the answer, a fast, heavily armed fighter that could match a P-47 Thunderbolt in a straight fight and outmaneuver an F-6F Hellcat in a turn. American pilots encountered it, and for the first time in months, felt something close to unease. But the Frank rotted from the inside. Its hydraulic system leaked constantly, and brake failures on landing were so routine that pilots braced for them as a matter of procedure. Landing gear seized. Tires blew on crumbling airstrips. The powerful Ha-45 engine demanded high-octane aviation fuel that Japan could no longer reliably produce. By 1945, Franks were flying on diluted, low-grade fuel that fouled cylinders and strangled power output. A machine engineered to be lethal was being slowly poisoned by its own supply chain. The pilots knew exactly what was happening. They climbed in anyway. 7. Kawasaki Ki-100. The Ki-100 was born from desperation and, by some dark miracle, survived it. When Kawasaki could not source enough inline engines to keep Ki-61 production running, engineers bolted a Mitsubishi Ha-112 radial onto the existing Tony airframe, a field improvisation elevated to official policy. The result, almost against all logic, worked. The Ki-100 handled cleanly, climbed well, and its pilots, veteran survivors ground down by years of losing, called it the finest fighter Japan had produced. But that compliment arrived soaked in bitterness. It reached operational units in 1945. The airfields were already being strafed by American Mustangs. The fuel supply had collapsed to a trickle. The pilots assigned to it were teenagers who barely completed training. The Ki-100 was reliable in a way Japanese fighters almost never were, which made it all the more heartbreaking. It revealed what was possible, precisely when nothing was. It was good enough to survive the war. Japan, by that point, was not. 8. Kawasaki Ki-102 Randy. The Kawasaki Ki-102 was engineered to attack. A twin-engine assault aircraft, it mounted a brutal 57mm cannon in its nose, called the Ho-401, a weapon designed to dismantle Allied armor, rupture troop concentrations, and tear apart coastal defenses as Japan's enemies closed on the home islands. The concept had teeth. But the Randy arrived too late for the war it was built to fight, and its crews arrived too exhausted to fly it well. The twin Ha-112 radial engines generated a violent torque effect on takeoff that demanded total, white-knuckled concentration from pilots already hollowed out by attrition. The rear gunner's cockpit offered visibility so poor that aerial engagements felt like fighting blindfolded. American P-38 pilots who encountered it enjoyed a clinical advantage in both altitude and speed. The Randy simply could not run or climb fast enough to force a favorable engagement. It was a powerful, specialized weapon deployed into a war whose outcome had already been determined. Its crews understood that. The weight of that knowledge filled every cockpit. 9. Mitsubishi A twin-engine long-range fighter with performance figures that genuinely startled American evaluators in post-war testing, fast, agile, well-armed, and capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. It represented the sharpest edge of what Japanese aviation engineering could produce. But the Ki-83 never reached the war. American bombing campaigns had paralyzed Japanese manufacturing by the time it was ready, and only a handful of prototypes emerged from the wreckage of the production system. The few test pilots who flew it noted vibration issues in the twin Mitsubishi Ha-211 engines that required resolution. The airframe was untested under combat stress. Engineers knew it needed months of refinement. They did not have months. They had weeks. Those pilots sat in a cockpit that hummed with potential, flying circuits over airfields where the fuel was rationed and the mechanics worked by candlelight after the generators failed. The Ki-83 was a might-have-been. In 1945, Japan had no room for those. 10. Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi. The Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi, sword, was not designed to come back. There is no clinical way to soften that fact. Japan's engineers built it with a deliberate, institutional brutality, a crude airframe constructed from non-strategic materials, wood, low-grade steel, recycled aluminum, powered by whatever engine was available, fitted with a single hardpoint for a bomb. The landing gear was designed to be jettisoned after takeoff. There was no purpose in landing. The pilot who climbed into a Tsurugi understood, with complete clarity, what the aircraft and the Empire demanded of him. The cockpit was bare. Stripped. The controls were sluggish, an airframe never optimized for anything beyond pointing itself at the hull of an American warship. Young men, some barely trained, sat in those seats and felt the full, suffocating weight of an empire that had chosen to spend them like ammunition. American sailors who survived kamikaze strikes described the sound of incoming aircraft. None of them could describe those pilots. That silence says everything. 11. Mitsubishi A5M Claude. The Mitsubishi A5M Claude was the foundation, ancestor of every Japanese naval fighter that came after it. An open-cockpit monoplane that shocked military observers in China with its agility and lethality, it established Japan's reputation as a builder of world-class fighter aircraft. But stand at the edge of the cockpit and look in. There was no canopy. Wind blasted the pilot's face at speed. Goggles fogged and iced at altitude. In winter operations over the Chinese mainland, the cold was brutal and relentless, stealing dexterity and focus. The fixed landing gear dragged in every dive. Its two 7.7mm machine guns were already anemic by the standards of what the war would demand. By late 1941, the Claude was obsolete, but it was still flying, still killing, in secondary theaters against under-equipped opponents. The moment it met modern aircraft, British Hurricanes, American Tomahawks, it died fast. The open cockpit that once felt like freedom now felt like exposure. Raw. Unarmored. And entirely outclassed. 12. Mitsubishi A6M Zero or Zeke. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero. No aircraft in the Pacific War carried more mythology, or a greater body count in both directions. In 1941, it was a revelation. Its combat range was seemingly impossible. Its turn radius was supernatural. American and British pilots who encountered it in those first, catastrophic months and survived spent sleepless nights trying to explain what had hit them. But the Zero's genius was also its death warrant. To achieve that extraordinary performance, Mitsubishi's engineers stripped out everything that protected the man inside. No self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor behind the pilot's seat, no structural reinforcement that could absorb a dive above 300 miles per hour without the controls locking into rigid, useless stone. Experienced American pilots, flying Hellcats, Corsairs, P-38s, learned to exploit those limits with cold precision. Climb, dive, attack, extend. Never circle. Never give it the turning fight it wanted. By 1944, the Zero's cockpit smelled of raw fuel and hot aluminum and something else. The particular dread of a pilot who understood exactly how the math had changed. 13. Kawanishi N1KJ George. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shinden, Violet Lightning, arrived carrying the weight of a war already slipping away and, despite everything, briefly threatened to matter. Originally evolved from a floatplane, it was rebuilt into a land-based interceptor of genuine capability, and American Hellcat pilots who encountered it over Formosa and the Philippines described the experience with something approaching professional unease. It could turn. It could climb hard. It bit back. But the George was haunted by its own mechanical complexity. Its Nakajima Hamar Ha-45 engine, the same cursed power plant that troubled other late-war Japanese fighters, was chronically unreliable, prone to overheating, and perpetually starved of the spare parts needed to keep it running. The engine sat low in the fuselage on a long, vibration-prone propeller shaft that maintenance crews dreaded opening. Ground clearance was dangerously narrow. Propeller strikes on forward airstrips destroyed aircraft that had survived combat. It was better than almost anything else Japan fielded in 1944. But in that sky, against those enemies, better than most had long since ceased to be enough. 14. Mitsubishi J2M Raiden Jack. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden Thunderbolt was purpose-built to kill B-29s. Japan's engineers understood what was coming from the Marianas, and they designed the Jack around one brutal priority: climb faster than the superfortress, get above it, and tear it apart. On paper, the climb rate justified everything. Pilots launching against incoming raid streams trusted those numbers. But the Raiden's cockpit was equal parts furnace and coffin. Its Mitsubishi Kasei engine vibrated with an intensity that rattled instrument needles loose from their mounts and propagated through the airframe into the pilot's spine on every flight. The tightly fitted cowling, sacrifice for aerodynamic cleanliness, meant cooling airflow was perpetually inadequate, and overheating was a standing operational threat, not an emergency. Forward visibility during takeoff was nearly non-existent, the nose high and blind. American pilots who engaged Raidens at altitude found them dangerous in a vertical fight, sluggish in any other. Above 20,000 feet, the Jack had genuine teeth. Below that, it was uncomfortable, unreliable, and deeply, intimately unforgiving of any mistake. 15. Nakajima J1N Gecko Irving. The Nakajima J1N Gecko, Moonlight, stumbled into its own purpose. Designed as a long-range escort fighter, it failed comprehensively in that role: too slow, too heavy, and too unmaneuverable to protect the bombers it was meant to accompany. The Navy nearly discarded it. Then, through adaptation and improvisation, it became something else entirely: a night interceptor, armed with oblique upward-firing cannon, hunting B-29s from below in total darkness. It was a desperate conversion. The cockpit at night was a study in controlled fear. Early versions carried no radar, leaving the crew to strain their eyes into blackness, hunting the faint orange glow of bomber exhaust. The airframe groaned during hard maneuvering, and its twin Nakajima Sakai radials delivered inconsistent power that pilots learned never to fully trust. The Irving was never a beautiful solution to anything. It was a jury-rigged answer to an impossible problem, flown by tired men in the dark. American B-29 crews who encountered it at night described it as a presence they never quite saw coming. That invisibility was the most dangerous thing about it. 16. Kyushu J7W Shinden. The Kyushu J7W Shinden, magnificent lightning, looked like nothing that had ever flown before. A canard pusher configuration, its engine mounted at the rear, its propeller spinning behind the pilot, its forward canard wings carrying control surfaces that defied conventional design logic. Japan's engineers conceived it as the ultimate B-29 interceptor, a machine so unconventional in form and so violent in performance that it might rewrite the final chapter of the air war over the home islands. But the Shinden existed almost entirely as ambition. Only 2 prototypes were completed before the war ended. The first flew in August 1945, 11 days before Japan's surrender. In those brief, frantic test flights, the propeller shaft vibrated at a frequency that alarmed the test pilot. The rudder authority was insufficient for safe maneuvering. The rear-mounted engine created handling characteristics that needed months, perhaps years, of careful resolution. Instead, it had days. The Shinden is the purest image of Japan's final year: radical brilliance, exhausted resources, and not a single second left on the clock. 17. Aichi S1A Denko. The Aichi S1A Denko, bolt of lightning, may be the most forgotten aircraft in this entire chronicle, and that absence is itself a kind of verdict. Designed as a purpose-built night interceptor to defend the Japanese home islands against the B-29 incendiary raids that were reducing entire cities to cinders, the Denko was conceived with urgency and built with almost none. Japan's aviation industry was collapsing beneath the weight of American bombing, chronic fuel shortages, and an institutional paralysis that no amount of engineering talent could overcome. The Hamar engines required for the Denko were unavailable. The manufacturing techniques demanded by its airframe were beyond what remained of Japan's industrial capacity. It never flew. Not once. It existed as wooden mock-ups, as technical drawings, as arguments between exhausted engineers and buildings whose windows had been blown out by the previous night's raid. The pilots who might have flown it were already dead, or assigned to kamikaze units, or simply waiting for an end they could all feel approaching. The Denko was Japan's final wish, written in aluminum and ambition. Neither was enough.